Sometimes the loneliest among us see things others miss. Sometimes what looks broken carries the greatest treasure. Elias Boone lived alone in a worn-down shack, forgotten by most folks in town. At an old auction, he spent his last dollar on a limping horse nobody wanted. People laughed at the foolish old cowboy. But that night, the mare grew restless, pulling toward something in the distance. At dawn, Elias let her lead him across the valley to an empty canyon. There, she stopped at a patch of disturbed earth. When Elias dug down, his shovel struck metal, a chest filled with gold coins worth $11 million. But how did a lame horse know where a century-old treasure was buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind spoke to Elias Boone in ways most folks wouldn't understand. Not in words, mind you, but in the kind of language that settles deep in a man's bones after decades of listening. From his weathered porch, he could hear it carrying stories across the dying cattle trail that stretched like a scar through the Wyoming territory. The trail that once brought prosperity to Cedar Ridge now brought only dust and memories. His shack sat on the edge of everything, the edge of town, the edge of civilization, the edge of hope itself. The timber had weathered to the color of old pewter, and the roof bore patches like scars from too many harsh winters. Inside, the single room held everything a man needed and nothing he didn't. A narrow bed with a quilt his mother had sewn 40 years past, a cast-iron stove that heated beans and coffee with equal indifference, and a rough-hewn table where he ate his meals alone. But it was his father's worn Bible that held the place of honor on that table. The leather binding had cracked like dried riverbed, and the pages bore the yellowed stains of countless readings by lamplight. Samuel Boone had been a man of few words but deep faith, and he'd passed both qualities to his son, along with the conviction that every living thing deserved kindness, especially the broken ones. Elias had learned that lesson well during his 57 years on this earth. He'd been born to ranching, raised on the lazy bee spread that his grandfather had carved from wilderness with nothing but determination and calloused hands. For 30 years, he'd worked that land with his father, watching it grow from a modest operation to a respectable outfit that could support 2 families. He'd even taken a wife, sweet Sarah McKinnon, whose laugh could chase the shadows from the darkest day. But the drought of '85 had been merciless, followed by the brutal winter of '86 that killed half their herd. When the bank came calling, Elias had nothing left to offer but the deed to the land his family had poured their lives into. Sarah had stood by him through the lean years, but when consumption took her 3 winters back, it took the last of his reason to stay connected to the world of ordinary folks. Now he made his living doing odd jobs around Cedar Ridge, mending fences, shoeing horses, fixing whatever needed fixing for folks who remembered when he'd been somebody. The work paid enough for beans and coffee, tobacco for his evening pipe, and grain for whatever stray animal found its way to his door. And strays did find him, with the peculiar certainty of creatures who recognized their own kind. There was Moses, the 3-legged dog who'd showed up during a blizzard and never left. There was Matilda, the one-eyed barn cat who hunted mice with the fierce determination of a creature who'd learned to see the world differently. And there had been others over the years, wounded birds, abandoned kittens, horses too old or broken for anyone else to bother with. The town of Cedar Ridge had mixed feelings about Elias Boone. Some folks, like Martha Hendricks, who ran the general store, saw him as a decent man dealt a hard hand. She'd slip an extra potato into his weekly provisions without mentioning it, or fail to charge him for the penny candy he sometimes bought for the children who gathered around him when he came to town. Martha had known him since they were both young, had danced with him at the church social before he'd set his sights on Sarah McKinnon. She was a handsome woman still, with graying brown hair she kept pinned in a practical bun, and eyes that missed nothing. Her store served as the unofficial gathering place for news and gossip, and she had a way of steering conversations away from unkind speculation about Elias's circumstances. Doc Sullivan, the town's physician, respected Elias for different reasons. He'd seen how gently the man handled injured animals, how he'd sit with a sick horse through the night, talking to it in that quiet voice that seemed to calm even the most fractious creature. The doc was a learned man who'd trained back east before coming to Wyoming for his health, and he recognized intelligence when he saw it, regardless of how it dressed. "That man has a gift," Doc would say when folks questioned Elias's methods. "Animals know things we've forgotten. They can sense who means them well." Sheriff Wade Porter occupied middle ground in the town's opinion of Elias. He found the man peculiar but harmless, perhaps a bit too inclined towards solitude for his own good. Porter was a practical man who valued order above all else, and while Elias caused no trouble, his very existence seemed to unsettle the sheriff's sense of how things ought to be. A man should have people, Porter believed. A man should belong somewhere. But Elias belonged to the wind and the wide spaces, to the rhythm of seasons and the language of creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. He rose with the sun and slept when darkness fell, lived by the simple calendar of survival that had guided men long before there were towns or laws or opinions about how a person ought to conduct his life. On this particular morning, the wind carried news of change. Elias could feel it in the restless way the cottonwoods shivered their leaves, in the nervous stamping of Moses as the old dog watched the horizon. Change had a scent to it, sharp and metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm. The auction was set for noon at the Hendricks place, where old Tom Hendricks had finally succumbed to the cancer that had been eating at him for 2 years. Martha was selling off the livestock and equipment, keeping only what she needed to maintain the store. It was a common enough occurrence in these parts, death or hardship forcing the sale of a life's accumulation. Elias hadn't planned to attend. He had no money for bidding and little use for another mouth to feed. But something in the wind's whisper suggested he should be there, the same something that had guided him to Moses during that blizzard and Matilda on the night she'd crawled under his porch to birth her kittens. He dressed in his good clothes, the brown wool trousers Sarah had mended for the last time before she died, and the white shirt that had yellowed, despite his best efforts to keep it clean. His hat, a battered Stetson that had seen better decades, sat square on his graying head as he walked the 2 miles into town. The auction had drawn a modest crowd. Ranchers from the surrounding spreads mingled with townspeople looking for bargains. Children ran between the adults' legs, while their mothers gossiped and their fathers evaluated the livestock with the practiced eyes of men who knew horseflesh. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Crawley, worked his way through the smaller items, first tools and tack, household goods and wagon parts. The bidding was spirited enough, though most items went for less than they'd have brought in better times. Then they brought out the horses, and Elias felt his heart constrict with familiar pain. There were 6 animals in all, ranging from a spirited young gelding that would bring good money to an ancient plough horse whose working days were long behind him. But it was the mare at the end of the line that caught and held his attention. She was a sorrel with white markings, probably 15 hands high, with the kind of refined head that spoke of good breeding somewhere in her past. But her left front leg bore the telltale signs of an old injury that had healed poorly, leaving her with a pronounced limp that made her virtually worthless for anything requiring speed or endurance. "Now this here's a gentle mare," Crawley announced, though his tone suggested he was making the best of a bad situation. "She's got years left in her, perfect for light work or maybe teaching youngsters to ride." The bidding was lackluster. A few ranchers made half-hearted offers, more out of politeness than genuine interest. When the price reached 50 cents, the bidding stalled entirely. Crawley looked around the crowd with the expression of a man trying to sell snow to Eskimos. "Come now, folks," he cajoled. "This is a fine animal, just needs the right situation. Do I hear 60 cents? Silence stretched like taffy in the afternoon heat. Elias found himself studying the mare's face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way she held herself despite her obvious discomfort. There was dignity in her bearing, the kind that spoke of pride unbroken by hardship. 50 cents, then, Crawley said with resignation. Going once. $1, Elias called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet crowd. Heads turned toward him, some in surprise, others in the kind of pity reserved for fools and drunkards. Martha Hendricks shot him a worried look, knowing as well as anyone that $1 represented a significant portion of his weekly income. "Dollar bid," Crawley announced, perking up at the prospect of closing the sale. "Do I hear 125? The silence stretched longer this time, filled with the uncomfortable awareness that they were watching a man make a foolish decision for reasons they couldn't understand. Finally, Crawley brought down his gavel. Sold to Elias Boone for $1. The crowd dispersed with the particular awkwardness that follows a moment when someone's private struggles become public entertainment. Elias approached the mare slowly, letting her catch his scent and grow accustomed to his presence. Up close, he could see the full extent of her condition, not just the damaged leg, but the dullness in her coat that spoke of inadequate feed and the way she favored her right side when she shifted her weight. "Easy, girl," he murmured, extending his hand for her to sniff. "Looks like we're both a little worse for wear." The mare accepted his touch with the resignation of a creature who'd learned not to expect much from human contact. But when he stroked her neck, she leaned into the pressure slightly, as if remembering a time when such gestures had been common. "What you gonna call her?" Martha Hendricks appeared at his elbow, concern creasing her features. Elias considered the question as he continued stroking the mare's neck. "Haven't thought about it," he admitted. "Suppose something will come to mind." Elias. Martha's voice carried the weight of long friendship and longer worry. "You sure you can afford to take on another mouth to feed?" He turned to look at her, noting the genuine care in her eyes. Martha had been Sarah's friend too, had held her hand during the long nights when the consumption made breathing an ordeal. She had every right to question his judgment. "Sometimes a man finds exactly what he needs," he said quietly, "even when he doesn't know he's looking for it." Martha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I suppose that's true enough. Tom always said you had a way with creatures that needed understanding." As if summoned by the mention of her late husband's name, the weight of loss settled over them both. Tom Hendricks had been a good man, steady and kind, who'd built a modest life through honest work and careful planning. His death had reminded everyone in Cedar Ridge of how quickly circumstances could change, how thin the line was between security and destitution. "You take care of her," Martha said finally, "and take care of yourself." The walk home took longer than usual as Elias adjusted his pace to accommodate the mare's limp. She followed docilely enough, though he noticed how her ears swiveled constantly, as if she were listening for something only she could hear. By the time they reached his shack, the sun had begun its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Elias led the mare to the small corral he'd built years ago for the occasional horse that needed temporary shelter. The fence was sound enough, though the posts showed their age, and there was a lean-to that would provide some protection from the weather. As he removed the lead rope, the mare turned to look at him directly, and for a moment Elias had the unsettling sensation that she was trying to communicate something important. Her eyes held an intensity that seemed almost human, a quality he'd rarely seen in animals, no matter how intelligent. "What is it, girl?" he asked softly. "What's got you so troubled?" But the mare only stamped her good front foot and moved to investigate the hay he'd spread for her, leaving Elias with the distinct feeling that she knew something he didn't. As he walked back to his shack in the gathering dusk, he couldn't shake the impression that his life had just taken a turn toward something he couldn't yet name or understand. That night, as he sat on his porch smoking his evening pipe, the mare's restlessness was evident even in the dim light from his oil lamp. She paced the small corral as much as her injured leg would allow, frequently stopping to stare off toward the eastern canyon country. Her behavior reminded him of Moses during thunderstorms, when the old dog would whine and pace, sensing electrical tension in the air long before the first lightning flash. "Settle down, girl," he called softly. "Tomorrow's another day." But even as he spoke the words, Elias Boone suspected that tomorrow would bring something different, something that would test the quiet equilibrium he'd built around his solitary life. The wind whispered agreement through the cottonwood leaves, carrying with it the scent of change and the promise of revelations yet to come. Dawn came with the peculiar stillness that sometimes precedes momentous events, though Elias had no way of knowing this as he stepped onto his porch with his first cup of coffee. The mare stood at the far edge of the corral, her attention fixed on the eastern horizon with an intensity that made the hair on his neck prickle. She hadn't touched the hay he'd given her the night before, and her restlessness had continued through the dark hours, occasionally punctuated by soft nickering that sounded almost like conversation. "What's got into you, girl?" he murmured, approaching the fence with his coffee cup in hand. At the sound of his voice, the mare turned toward him, and Elias caught his breath. Her eyes held a clarity and purpose that seemed impossible in an animal, especially one that had appeared so resigned the day before. She walked to the gate with determined steps despite her limp, then stood there looking at him with an expression that could only be described as expectant. Moses limped over from his favored spot under the cottonwood, sensing the unusual tension in the air. The old dog's hackles were slightly raised, not in aggression, but in the way of a creature encountering something beyond his understanding. Even Matilda, who rarely showed herself during daylight hours, sat perched on the porch railing, her single eye fixed on the mare with feline intensity. Elias set down his coffee cup and studied the mare more carefully. In the morning light, he could see details that had escaped his notice the previous day. Her coat, while dull from poor care, showed the dappled pattern of quality breeding. Her conformation, despite the damaged leg, spoke of bloodlines that had once commanded respect. But it was something else entirely that held his attention, a quality of alertness and determination that suggested she was waiting for something specific to happen. "You want out, is that it?" he asked, though the question felt inadequate for what he was observing. The mare bobbed her head once, a gesture so deliberate it made Elias's pulse quicken. He'd worked with horses for 40 years, and while he'd seen them display remarkable intelligence, this felt different. This felt like communication. Against his better judgment, he opened the gate. The mare stepped through immediately, but instead of wandering toward the sparse grass near the creek, she moved with purpose toward the eastern trail that led into the canyon country. She walked perhaps 20 yards, then stopped and looked back at him, her meaning unmistakable. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You want me to follow you?" It wasn't a question. The mare's entire posture radiated expectation and urgency, as if she'd been waiting years for this moment and couldn't afford to waste it. She took a few more steps along the trail, then paused again, clearly waiting for him to make a decision. Every rational thought in Elias's head screamed warnings. Following an animal into the wilderness based on intuition alone was the kind of foolishness that got men lost, or worse. The canyon country was unforgiving terrain, full of hidden gullies and unstable rock formations that could trap or injure the unwary. He had responsibilities, chores to complete, errands to run in town, the basic maintenance of survival that couldn't wait for flights of fancy. But something deeper than reason was stirring in his chest, the same instinct that had guided him to rescue so many wounded creatures over the years. This mare needed something from him, something important enough to overcome her obvious pain and exhaustion. And if there was one thing Elias Boone had learned in his 57 years, it was to trust the wisdom of creatures who couldn't lie. He went back to the shack long enough to grab his hat, fill his canteen, and pocket the few remaining pieces of jerky from his meager stores. Moses whined and followed him to the corral gate, But Elias shook his head. "Not this time, old friend. That leg of yours wasn't made for canyon hiking." The dog's expression was so mournful that Elias almost relented, but the mare's increasing agitation decided him. Whatever this journey entailed, it needed to happen soon, and it needed to happen without the complications that would come from bringing a three-legged dog along. The mare set a pace that accommodated her injury while still covering ground efficiently. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, following game trails and natural passages through the broken landscape with the confidence of long familiarity. Elias found himself studying the terrain with new eyes, noting features he'd never paid attention to, despite having lived in the area for decades. They climbed steadily for the better part of an hour, working their way through stands of juniper and over rocky outcroppings that offered increasingly dramatic views of the valley below. The mare never hesitated at trail junctions, never showed uncertainty about direction. She moved with the purposefulness of someone following a map burned into memory. The canyon she finally led him to was one Elias had never explored, hidden behind a cluster of massive boulders that made it nearly invisible from the main trail. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for horse and rider, but it opened into a sheltered space, perhaps 50 yards across and twice that in length. High walls provided protection from wind and weather, and a small spring emerged from the rock face at the far end, creating a pool of clear water before disappearing again underground. It was a perfect hideaway, the kind of place that could shelter travelers who needed to remain unseen. The grass was sparse but adequate, and there were signs of long-ago human habitation, the remnants of a fire ring, a few scattered stones that might once have supported shelter, and carved initials on the smooth rock wall near the spring. But the mare wasn't interested in these historical curiosities. She moved directly to a section of ground near the center of the canyon that looked completely unremarkable to Elias's eyes. The earth was slightly lower there, as if it had settled over time, and the sparse vegetation grew in a pattern that might have been natural or might have indicated disturbance decades old. The mare stopped at this spot and began pawing the ground with her good front foot, scraping away the thin layer of soil and dried grass with increasing urgency. She paused to look at Elias, then resumed her digging, making it clear what she expected him to do. "You want me to dig here?" he said aloud, needing to hear the words to believe them. The mare's response was to step back and fix him with that unnervingly intelligent gaze, waiting for him to understand what she'd brought him to find. Elias had no tools with him except his pocket knife, hardly adequate for serious excavation, but the mare's certainty was infectious, and his curiosity had been thoroughly aroused. He began digging with his hands, clearing away the loose topsoil, and discovering that the earth beneath was indeed softer than it should have been, as if it had been disturbed and backfilled at some point in the past. The work was slow and difficult without proper tools, but as he dug deeper, his fingers encountered something that made his heart race. About 18 inches down, his knuckles scraped against something hard and metallic. He dug more carefully now, clearing the soil away from what appeared to be the corner of a metal object. By the time he'd exposed enough to understand what he'd found, the sun was directly overhead, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. The object was a strongbox, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot wide, made of iron that had oxidized but remained structurally sound. It was heavier than he'd expected, requiring all his strength to lift it from the hole he'd excavated. The box bore no identifying marks except for scratches and dents that spoke of hard use and careful concealment. The lock had long since corroded beyond functionality, and when Elias struck it with a rock, it crumbled away, allowing him to lift the lid with trembling hands. The sight that greeted him defied comprehension. The box was filled with gold coins, hundreds of them, stacked and sorted with the kind of care that indicated someone had counted them many times. Some were American eagles, others were foreign denominations he didn't immediately recognize. but all of them gleamed with the unmistakable luster of genuine gold, and even his untrained eye could see that many were quite old. Elias sank back on his heels, staring at the treasure with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The coins represented more wealth than he'd ever imagined possessing, enough to buy a dozen ranches or live in luxury for the rest of his life. But more than the monetary value, the discovery raised questions that made his head spin. How had a lame horse known exactly where to find buried treasure? Who had hidden this wealth, and why hadn't they returned for it? How long had it been here, waiting for someone to uncover it? The mare seemed satisfied now that her purpose had been accomplished. She moved to the spring to drink deeply, then began grazing on the sparse grass as if this were the most natural outcome in the world. Her earlier urgency had been replaced by a kind of peaceful contentment that only deepened the mystery. Elias examined several of the coins more closely, noting dates that ranged from the 1850s to the 1870s. Some bore the marks of banks he recognized from Denver and Colorado Springs, while others carried foreign stamps that suggested they'd traveled considerable distances before ending up in this hidden canyon. The total value was impossible to calculate without expert assessment, but even a conservative estimate suggested he was looking at a fortune that would transform his life completely. But transformation, he was beginning to understand, came with its own set of complications. This wasn't money he'd earned through honest work or inherited through family connection. This was treasure of unknown origin, hidden for reasons he couldn't begin to guess. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to conceal this wealth, and the very fact that it remained hidden suggested that the original owner had met with misfortune. The ethical implications were staggering. Did treasure belong to whoever found it or to whoever had originally owned it? If the money had been stolen, did that change his moral obligations? And perhaps most importantly, how could he explain the discovery without revealing the mare's impossible knowledge of its location? As he carefully replaced the coins in the strongbox, Elias noticed something else that had escaped his initial attention. Wedged between the stacks of gold was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. He unfolded it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a hand-drawn map showing the relative positions of the canyon, the spring, and several other locations marked with symbols he didn't recognize. The implications hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't the only cache. The map suggested there were other hiding places, other treasures waiting to be discovered by someone who knew where to look. And somehow, impossibly, the mare seemed to possess that knowledge. He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, then hefted the strongbox and carried it to a shaded spot near the spring. The mare watched his movements with approval, occasionally lifting her head from grazing to check his progress. Her behavior suggested this was all proceeding according to some plan he couldn't understand. The journey back to his shack was both easier and more difficult than the morning's trek. The mare seemed energized by their success, moving with less apparent discomfort despite her injury. But Elias found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, hyper-aware of every sound and movement in the landscape around them. The weight of the treasure made him feel exposed and vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced before. By the time they reached home, the sun was beginning its descent toward evening, and Moses was beside himself with relief at their return. The old dog circled them both repeatedly, sniffing at the strongbox with the kind of intensity that suggested he understood something significant had occurred. Elias carried the treasure into his shack and placed it on the rough table next to his father's Bible. The contrast between the two objects, one representing spiritual wealth, the other material fortune, wasn't lost on him. He'd spent most of his adult life believing that contentment came from simple pleasures and honest work. Now he faced the possibility that a single day had made him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. But wealth, he was discovering, brought its own form of poverty. The coins represented choices he'd never had to make, responsibilities he'd never had to bear, and dangers he'd never had to consider. For the first time since Sarah's death, Elias Boone felt truly afraid not of hardship or loneliness, but of prosperity and the complications that would inevitably follow. Outside, the mare had settled into the corral with obvious satisfaction, finally showing interest in the hay he'd provided. But even as she ate, her ears remained alert, swiveling occasionally toward the eastern canyon, as if she were listening for something only she could hear. Whatever had driven her to lead him to the treasure, Elias suspected their adventure was far from over. As darkness fell and he lit his evening lamp, the gold coins gleamed with their own inner fire, beautiful and ominous in equal measure. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the star-filled sky, and Elias Boone wondered if his own days of simple solitude were drawing to a close. Sleep proved elusive that first night after the discovery. Elias lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while his mind churned through the implications of what he'd found. Every creak of the old shack's timber made him tense. Every night, sound from the surrounding wilderness set his nerves on edge. The strongbox sat on his table like a sleeping beast, its presence transforming his familiar sanctuary into something foreign and uncertain. By dawn, he'd made his first decision. The treasure needed to be hidden, at least until he could determine its origins and his legal standing. But first, he needed answers, and those would require research that went beyond his own limited knowledge. After completing his morning chores and ensuring the mare was comfortable, Elias walked into Cedar Ridge with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The town's small library occupied the back room of the schoolhouse, tended by Miss Eleanor Hartwell, the schoolma'am who'd arrived from Boston 3 years earlier with boxes of books and revolutionary ideas about education. "Mr. Boone," she greeted him with surprise as he entered the cramped room, lined floor to ceiling with volumes. "I don't believe I've seen you here before." Eleanor Hartwell was a woman of perhaps 35, with intelligent grey eyes and prematurely silver hair that she wore in a style more practical than fashionable. She'd earned the respect of Cedar Ridge's parents through her dedication to their children's education, though some still questioned the wisdom of hiring an unmarried woman from back east. "I'm hoping you might have some books about the history of this area," Elias said, removing his hat, "particularly anything about banking or criminal activity from the past 20 years or so." Miss Hartwell's eyebrows rose slightly, but she was too polite to inquire about his sudden interest in local history. "We have several volumes that might help. The territorial archives include newspaper collections and some official records. May I ask what specific period you're researching?" "The 1870s, mostly. Looking for information about bank robberies or large thefts in Colorado and Wyoming territories." She moved efficiently through the stacks, selecting several bound volumes of newspaper reprints and a thick tome titled Criminal History of the Western Territories. As she placed them on the reading table, her expression grew curious. "This is quite a change from your usual interests, Mr. Boone. Are you perhaps writing something?" The question caught him off guard. Writing had never occurred to him, but it provided a convenient explanation for his research. "Just trying to understand some stories I've heard." "Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with the present." Miss Hartwell nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed it does. These materials should give you a good foundation. The newspaper archives are particularly thorough for major crimes. Editors of that era seem to relish reporting on dramatic robberies and their aftermath." Elias spent the morning poring over the records, his attention sharpening when he found what he was looking for. The Denver Mountain News, dated September 15, 1874, carried a front-page story that made his blood run cold. "Daring daylight robbery nets thieves, 200 in gold." The article detailed the theft of a massive shipment of gold coins from the First National Bank of Colorado Springs. The robbery had been carried out by a gang of 5 men, led by someone known only as Gentleman Jim, described as unusually polite and well-spoken for an outlaw. The stolen money had been destined for widows' pensions and an orphanage fund, making the crime particularly heinous in the public eye. More disturbing still was the description of the theft's execution. The robbers had shown intimate knowledge of the bank's operations and the timing of the gold shipment, suggesting inside information. 3 bank employees had been killed during the robbery, and a 4th had died later from his wounds. Follow-up articles over the subsequent months painted a picture of a massive manhunt that had consumed significant territorial resources. 2 members of the gang had been captured and hanged within weeks of the robbery. A 3rd had been shot and killed while resisting arrest near the Colorado-Wyoming border. But Gentleman Jim and his remaining partner had vanished completely, along with the stolen gold. The final article Elias found was dated November 10, 1874. Gentleman Jim, captured and hanged, stolen gold remains missing. According to the report, James Cassidy, his real name, had been captured near the town of Laramie after a tip from an informant. He'd maintained his innocence regarding the murders, claiming he'd never intended violence and that his partner had killed the bank employees without his knowledge or consent. Despite his protestations, he'd been tried, convicted, and executed within a week of his capture. The gold had never been recovered. Elias leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling from the implications. If the coins in his possession were indeed from this robbery, he was holding money that had been stolen from widows and orphans. The moral weight of this knowledge settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, but questions remained. How had the gold ended up in that canyon? Had Cassidy hidden it there before his capture? And how had the mare known its location with such impossible certainty? "Find what you were looking for?" Miss Hartwell inquired as he began closing the volumes. "More than I wanted to, actually," Elias replied honestly. "Sometimes the truth is more complicated than ignorance." The schoolmarm studied his face with the perception that had made her an effective teacher. Knowledge often brings responsibility we didn't expect to bear, but understanding the past is the only way to make peace with it. Her words followed him as he left the library and made his way through town, noting details he'd previously ignored. The prosperity of certain businesses, the fine clothing worn by some families, the subtle hierarchies that governed social interactions, all of it seemed different now that he understood how easily circumstances could change. At the general store, Martha Hendricks greeted him with her usual warmth, though he detected a note of concern in her manner. "You're looking troubled today, Elias. Everything all right?" "Just thinking about things," he replied, selecting his usual modest provisions. "Martha, what do you remember about the early days of the Blackwood Bank? When did Cornelius's family first come to this area?" Martha's expression grew thoughtful as she tallied his purchases. "Oh, that would be around 1,875, I believe. Old Jeremiah Blackwood arrived with enough capital to establish the bank and buy up several struggling properties. Quite a windfall for a man who claimed to come from modest circumstances back east." The timing made Elias's stomach clench. 1,875, just months after the Colorado Springs robbery and Cassidy's execution. Did anyone ever question where his money came from? "Not openly," Martha said carefully. "But there was talk, naturally. A man doesn't usually arrive in frontier territory with that kind of wealth, unless he's running from something or towards something. But Jeremiah was a smooth talker, very respectable in his dealings. He married well, contributed to the church, helped establish several businesses in town. And his son Cornelius?" Martha's expression cooled slightly. "Cut from different cloth, that one. Where Jeremiah at least maintained the appearance of Christian charity, Cornelius seems to view every transaction as an opportunity to gain advantage. He's been buying up properties from folks who can't make their loan payments, consolidating land for purposes he keeps to himself." This information added another layer of complexity to Elias's situation. If the Blackwood family fortune had been built on stolen gold that was rightfully owed to widows and orphans, then the current generation was continuing to profit from historical injustice. On his way home, Elias encountered Sheriff Porter outside the courthouse. The lawman's greeting was cordial but professional, with the hint of curiosity that always seemed to accompany their interactions. "Afternoon, Elias. Heard you were doing some research at the schoolhouse today. Thinking of writing your memoirs?" The question was posed lightly, but Elias detected an undercurrent of genuine interest. "Just trying to understand some local history, Sheriff. Amazing how much happened in these parts that most folks have forgotten." "Indeed," Porter replied, his pale eyes studying Elias's face. "Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, though. The past has a way of creating complications for the present." Was there a warning in those words, or was Elias reading too much into casual conversation? He couldn't be sure, but the exchange left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. The mare seemed to sense his agitation when he returned to the shack. She watched him with that unsettling intelligence as he went through the motions of his evening routine, her attention particularly focused when he moved the strongbox from the table to a hiding place beneath loose floorboards in the corner of the room. That night, as he sat on his porch trying to find peace in his evening pipe, Elias noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were fresh hoofprints near his corral, hoofprints that didn't match those of his mare or any of the horses he'd seen in town recently. Someone had been watching his property, and they'd been close enough to observe his daily activities. The implications were terrifying. Had someone seen him return from the canyon with the strongbox? Did others know about the treasure's existence? And if so, how much danger was he in from people who might be willing to kill for that kind of wealth? As he prepared for another sleepless night, Elias found himself studying the faded wanted poster he'd discovered tucked among the gold coins. The drawing of James Gentleman Jim Cassidy showed a man of perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and the kind of refined features that would indeed seem out of place on a typical outlaw. Below his portrait was a description that included details about his horse, a sorrel mare with distinctive white markings and a pronounced limp from an old injury. The description matched his mare perfectly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just harboring stolen gold, he was caring for a horse that had belonged to one of the most notorious criminals in territorial history. A horse that somehow, impossibly, remembered the locations where her master had hidden his ill-gotten gains. But if the mare had belonged to Cassidy, how had she ended up at Martha's auction? Who had cared for her during the 16 years since her master's execution? And why had she chosen now to reveal the secrets she'd carried for so long? These questions would have to wait for answers. What mattered now was survival, because Elias was beginning to understand that knowledge of the treasure's location made him either very valuable or very dangerous to people who might have their own claims on Cassidy's gold. He spent the remainder of the night alternately dozing and starting awake at every sound, his hand never far from the old Colt revolver he kept loaded beside his bed. The mare remained restless as well, occasionally moving to the edge of her corral to stare into the darkness as if she too sensed watchers in the night. By morning, Elias had reached another decision. He needed allies, people he could trust with at least part of the truth. And he needed to understand more about the mare's history before her past put them both in mortal danger. The revelation about the mare's identity gnawed at Elias through the long hours before dawn. When morning light finally crept across the valley, he approached her corral with new eyes, studying every detail of her appearance and behavior. If she truly was Cassidy's horse, then she was far older than any animal had a right to be, pushing 30 years at minimum, an age that should have left her barely able to stand, much less navigate difficult terrain with the purpose she'd shown. "What are you, girl?" he whispered as he offered her grain. "And what do you need from me?" The mare's response was to nuzzle his shoulder gently, then turn her attention to a section of her saddle blanket that had been gnawing at Elias's consciousness. There was something odd about the way the fabric bunched in one corner, as if something had been sewn inside the lining. With careful fingers, he examined the blanket more thoroughly, finding what felt like a stiff piece of material hidden within the padding. Using his pocket knife, he carefully opened the seam and extracted a folded piece of oiled leather, yellowed with age, but still intact. Inside, the leather wrapping was another map, more detailed than the one he'd found with the coins. This one showed not just the canyon where he'd discovered the strongbox, but two additional locations marked with different symbols. One appeared to be deeper in the canyon country, perhaps a day's ride to the northeast. The other was closer to town, in an area that looked disturbingly familiar. Studying the landmarks more carefully, Elias realized the third location was on property that now belonged to Cornelius Blackwood. The irony was bitter if this map was accurate. At least part of Cassidy's stolen treasure was hidden on land owned by the family who'd built their fortune on the proceeds of that same theft. The implications made his head spin. Had the Blackwood family known about the hidden treasure all along? Was their acquisition of that particular property coincidental, or had they specifically sought it out? And if they knew about the treasure, why hadn't they recovered it? These questions demanded investigation, but first Elias needed to understand more about the mare herself. Her impossible longevity and uncanny knowledge suggested something beyond normal animal intelligence. He'd heard stories from old-timers about horses that seemed to possess almost supernatural awareness, animals that could sense danger or navigate by instincts that defied explanation. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through his window, he saw Cornelius Blackwood himself riding up the trail, accompanied by two men Elias didn't recognize. The banker was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that came from wielding power over other people's lives. Elias quickly concealed the map and stepped onto his porch, affecting the casual demeanor of a man with nothing to hide. The effort felt transparent, but he had little choice but to play the role of the simple cowboy. "Mr. Boone," Blackwood called out as he dismounted. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was riding through the area and thought I'd stop to discuss a business proposition." The banker's companions remained mounted, their eyes constantly scanning the property with the alert attention of men accustomed to potential trouble. Both were armed and carried themselves with the confidence of professionals, though their clothes suggested they were trying to pass for ordinary ranch hands. "Don't get many visitors out this way," Elias replied carefully. "What kind of business did you have in mind?" Blackwood's smile was practiced and cold. "I've been consolidating properties in this area for a development project. Your land, while modest, sits in a strategic location that would complete a rather important parcel. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price, more than fair, actually." "Not looking to sell," Elias said simply. "This place suits me fine." "I understand your attachment," Blackwood continued, his tone remaining pleasant despite the rejection. "But I'm afraid circumstances in this territory are changing. Small landholders often find it difficult to maintain their properties without adequate resources. Banks, as you know, have certain obligations regarding unpaid debts." The threat was delicately worded, but unmistakable. Elias felt his temper rise, but kept his voice level. "I don't have any debts with your bank, Mr. Blackwood. Not yet." The banker agreed, but situations can change quickly. Equipment fails, animals sicken, crops fail. There are so many ways a man's fortunes can take a sudden turn for the worse. One of Blackwood's companions had been studying the mare with unusual interest. "That's a fine-looking horse you've got there," he commented. "Unusual markings. Mind if I take a closer look?" Every instinct screamed danger, but refusing would only increase suspicion. "Help yourself," Elias said, though his hand drifted instinctively toward the vicinity of his concealed revolver. The man dismounted and approached the corral with the practiced eye of someone who knew horses. He studied the mare's conformation and markings with an intensity that suggested this wasn't casual curiosity. After several minutes, he returned to his employer with a slight nod that made Elias's blood run cold. "Interesting animal," Blackwood observed. "She has the look of quality breeding, despite her obvious infirmity. Where did you acquire her?" Tom Hendricks's auction, Elias replied truthfully. Paid $1 for her. $1? Blackwood's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. That seems remarkably cheap for such a distinctive animal. I'm something of a horse enthusiast myself. I'd be curious to know her lineage. The conversation was moving into dangerous territory. Don't know much about her history, Elias said. Just figured she deserved a chance at a decent life. Admirable sentiment, Blackwood murmured, though his eyes remained calculating. Well, I won't take up more of your time, but I do hope you'll reconsider my offer. The development I'm planning would bring considerable prosperity to this area. It would be unfortunate if anyone were left out of such opportunities. After the men departed, Elias stood on his porch, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. The mare had remained agitated throughout the visit, pacing her corral and occasionally snorting in a way that suggested she recognized at least one of the visitors. The conversation had confirmed several of his worst fears. Blackwood's interest in his property wasn't coincidental, and the banker's companion had clearly recognized something significant about the mare. Elias was no longer dealing with abstract historical mysteries. He was caught up in something that posed immediate and personal danger. That afternoon, he decided to seek advice from someone he trusted. Doc Sullivan's office occupied the ground floor of his house on the outskirts of town, a location that afforded some privacy for sensitive conversations. The doctor greeted him with the warm concern of an old friend. "Elias, you look like a man carrying heavy burdens. What can I do for you?" Doc Sullivan was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who'd known Elias during his prosperous years, and their friendship had survived the reversal of his fortunes. The doctor was also a man of education and discretion, qualities that made him an ideal confidant for delicate matters. "Doc, I need some advice about a situation that's gotten more complicated than I know how to handle." The physician gestured toward a chair and poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept for medicinal purposes. "Tell me what's troubling you." Elias had rehearsed this conversation during the walk to town, deciding how much truth he could reveal without compromising either of them. Let's say a man found something valuable that might belong to someone else, something from long ago, where the rightful owner is dead, but there might be other people with claims on it. What would be the right thing to do? Doc Sullivan studied his guest's face with the perceptiveness that made him an effective physician. That's a complex question. Legally, treasure trove generally belongs to the finder, assuming it's on their property and there's no clear chain of ownership. Morally, the answer might be different. What if the valuable thing was stolen originally? What if it belonged to people who needed it for survival? Then the moral obligation becomes clearer, the doctor replied, though the practical considerations might be more complicated. Sometimes doing the right thing can put a person in considerable danger. The warning in his tone suggested that Doc Sullivan suspected more than Elias had revealed. "There's something else," the doctor continued. "I've heard rumors about unusual interest in certain properties around here. People asking questions about historical claims, about animals that might have belonged to notorious individuals from the past." Elias felt his heart race. What kind of people? The kind who work for men with enough money to buy information and enough influence to avoid uncomfortable questions. If you've stumbled onto something significant, Elias, you need to be very careful about who you trust. The conversation confirmed that Elias's situation was even more precarious than he'd realized. Others were actively searching for what he'd found, and they had resources that far exceeded his own. As he prepared to leave, Doc Sullivan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you've discovered, remember that some secrets are too dangerous for one man to carry alone. If you need help, really need help, there are people in this town who would stand with you against those who profit from old injustices." The walk home gave Elias time to process what he'd learned. The net was closing around him faster than he'd anticipated, and his options were becoming increasingly limited. He could try to return the treasure to its rightful owners if he could identify them after 16 years. He could attempt to expose the Blackwood family's connection to the original theft, or he could flee with what he'd found, leaving behind the only life he'd ever known. None of these choices offered easy solutions or guaranteed safety. When he reached his property, he found fresh evidence that his fears were justified. Someone had been through his shack while he was gone. Nothing was missing, but items had been moved slightly, searched by someone skilled enough to almost cover their tracks. The mare greeted his return with obvious relief, pressing close to the corral fence as if seeking comfort from his presence. As he fed her, Elias noticed she kept glancing toward the eastern canyon, her ears pricked forward with the intensity he'd learned to associate with her mysterious knowledge. "You think there's more we need to find, don't you, girl?" he murmured. Her response was a soft nicker that sounded almost like agreement. That night, as he prepared for what he suspected might be his last peaceful sleep for some time, Elias made a decision that would commit him irrevocably to a dangerous course. He would follow the mare to the second location on the map, whatever the risks. If others were closing in on his secret, he needed to understand the full scope of what Cassidy had hidden. And perhaps, in understanding the complete truth, he could find a way to honor both the law and his conscience while surviving the forces that were converging on his quiet life. The mare seemed to sense his resolve. For the first time since her arrival, she settled peacefully in her corral, as if she knew that tomorrow would bring the continuation of a journey that had been interrupted 16 years ago by a hangman's rope. Dawn came gray and overcast, matching Elias's mood as he prepared for the journey to the second location marked on Cassidy's map. The mare seemed to sense the importance of the day, standing alert at the corral gate despite the early hour. Her eyes held that familiar intensity, as if she'd been waiting for this moment as long as she'd waited for their first expedition. The route to the northeast canyon country would take them through more remote terrain than their previous journey, away from established trails and into areas where few people ventured. This isolation offered both safety and danger. They were less likely to encounter Blackwood's men, but if something went wrong, help would be impossibly far away. Elias packed more supplies this time, including a proper shovel, his rifle, and enough food and water for 2 days. The mare's limp seemed less pronounced this morning, as if anticipation were overriding her physical limitations. They set out before sunrise, following game trails that wound through stands of aspen and pine, climbing steadily into country that grew wilder with each mile. The mare moved with the same uncanny certainty she'd shown before, never hesitating at trail junctions or pausing to consider direction. By mid-morning, they'd reached terrain that Elias had never explored, despite decades of living in the area. The landscape was more dramatic here, deep ravines cut by spring runoff, towering rock formations that created natural monuments, and hidden valleys that could conceal entire communities. It was in one of these valleys that the mare finally stopped, at a location that perfectly matched the second mark on Cassidy's map. Unlike the first cache site, this area showed clear signs of long-ago habitation. The remains of a cabin foundation were still visible, along with the remnants of a corral and what appeared to be a makeshift grave marked by a cairn of carefully stacked stones. The mare led him directly to the gravesite, then stood back as if waiting for him to understand its significance. The stones had been arranged with obvious care, and someone had carved a simple cross into the largest rock. Below the cross, weathered but still legible, were the initials MC and the date 1874. The timing made Elias's pulse quicken. 1874 was the year of the Colorado Springs robbery, and MC could easily stand for a member of Cassidy's gang. According to the newspaper accounts he'd read, one of the robbers had been shot and killed near the Colorado-Wyoming border. Perhaps this was where that man had died, cared for by his surviving companions before they'd been forced to abandon his body. But the mare wasn't interested in the grave itself. She moved to a spot perhaps 20 feet away, near the ruins of what had once been a stone fire ring. Here, as before, she began pawing at the ground with urgent determination. Elias's excavation revealed another cache, though this one was smaller than the first and contained more than just gold. Wrapped in oiled canvas were personal effects that painted a vivid picture of the men who'd hidden them. Letters from families back east, a silver pocket watch engraved with the name Michael Cassidy, and a small leather journal filled with entries in a careful, educated hand. But it was the locket that stopped Elias cold. The silver pendant was beautifully crafted, containing a photograph of a young woman holding a small child. On the back was an inscription, "To my beloved Michael, with all my love, Catherine, remember us always." The journal's final entries, dated in late September 1874, told a story that contradicted everything Elias had read in the newspapers. According to the dying man's account, the Colorado Springs robbery had gone wrong from the beginning. The gang had been told the bank vault would be empty of people, but they'd walked into a situation where customers and employees were trapped in the crossfire. Michael Cassidy, apparently the brother of Gentleman Jim, had tried to stop the violence, but their hired gunman, a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, had killed the bank employees in cold blood to eliminate witnesses. The entry described Jim's horror and rage at the betrayal, his desperate attempt to stop the killing before it was too late. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. Jeremiah Blackwood, the founder of Cedar Ridge's banking empire, hadn't just stolen the recovered gold. He'd been part of the original robbery, the one responsible for the murders that had made the crime so notorious. He'd betrayed his own partners, then used his knowledge of their hiding places to recover the treasure after their deaths. Michael's journal entries grew weaker as his wound worsened, but his final words were clear. "Jim plans to return the money to those who lost it. We never meant for innocent people to die. Jeremiah will pay for what he's done, if not in this life, then in the next. The money belongs to the widows and children, not to murderers who hide behind respectability." Elias sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Blackwood family hadn't just profited from stolen money, they'd built their fortune on the blood of innocent people, then allowed others to hang for crimes they'd committed themselves. The mayor watched him process this information with what could only be described as satisfaction. Her mission was becoming clearer. She wasn't just leading him to treasure, but to evidence that could expose a decades-old injustice and clear her master's name. But with understanding came an even greater burden of responsibility. Elias now possessed proof of Cornelius Blackwood's family legacy, evidence that could destroy the most powerful man in the territory. Such knowledge made him incredibly dangerous to those who profited from the current arrangement, and incredibly valuable to those who sought justice. As he carefully repacked the evidence, Elias noticed that several pages had been torn from the back of Michael's journal. The missing sections might contain even more damaging information, details about Blackwood's involvement or the locations of additional evidence. The ride back to his property was tense and watchful. Elias found himself studying every ridge and outcropping, alert for signs of pursuit or surveillance. The mare seemed equally nervous, frequently stopping to listen for sounds that her keener senses might detect before his own. Their caution proved justified when they crested the final hill before his valley. Smoke was rising from the direction of his shack, too much smoke for his cooking fire, and coming from the wrong location. Elias dismounted and approached on foot, leaving the mare hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. What he found made his heart sink. His home had been systematically destroyed, furniture overturned and broken, floorboards pried up, even the walls bearing the marks of a thorough search. The strongbox's hiding place had been discovered and emptied, though the searchers had apparently found only the container, not its contents. More disturbing were the signs that this hadn't been a random act of vandalism. The destruction was methodical and professional, the work of men who knew how to search a property thoroughly. They'd been looking for something specific, and their failure to find it had led to increasingly aggressive tactics. Moses limped out from under the porch where he'd been hiding, whimpering with relief at Elias's return. The old dog bore no injuries, suggesting the searchers had been focused on their mission rather than casual cruelty. But Matilda was nowhere to be seen, and Elias feared the worst for the one-eyed cat who'd been his companion for so many years. A note had been left on his overturned table, written in an educated hand. "You have something that belongs to others. Return it willingly, and no further unpleasantness will be necessary. Refuse, and the consequences will be severe. You have 24 hours to consider your options." The message was unsigned, but Elias had no doubt about its origin. Cornelius Blackwood had decided that subtle threats were insufficient and had escalated to direct action. The destruction of his home was both punishment and warning, a demonstration of what would happen if he continued to resist. But the searchers had failed in their primary objective. The gold remained hidden in a location they hadn't discovered, and more importantly, they knew nothing about the evidence Elias had just recovered. Michael Cassidy's journal and personal effects could expose the truth about the Colorado Springs robbery and the Blackwood family's criminal foundation. As he stood among the ruins of his simple life, Elias faced a choice that would define his remaining years. He could surrender the treasure and try to rebuild his quiet existence, knowing that innocence had died for money that was rightfully theirs. Or he could fight back against forces that had operated with impunity for 16 years, risking everything to honor the dying wishes of men who'd tried to make amends for their mistakes. The mare's soft nicker from the trees seemed to carry the weight of expectation. She'd carried these secrets for decades, waiting for someone who would have the courage to act on them. Her master had died before he could return the stolen money to its rightful owners, but perhaps his mission could still be completed by a lonely cowboy who understood the value of redemption. Moses pressed against his leg, offering comfort in the way of faithful animals who sensed their humans' distress. The old dog's loyalty reminded Elias that some bonds transcended circumstances, that some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned regardless of the personal cost. As darkness gathered over the valley, Elias made his decision. He would not surrender to men who'd built their power on the graves of innocence. Instead, he would find a way to complete Jim Cassidy's mission, to return the stolen money to those who deserved it, and to expose the truth that had been buried for too long. The fight would be dangerous, and the odds heavily against him. But Elias Boone had learned long ago that a man's worth wasn't measured by his circumstances, but by his willingness to stand for what was right when standing was all he had left. The mare seemed to sense his resolve as he approached her hiding place. For the first time since their partnership began, she allowed him to touch her face, pressing her muzzle against his weathered palm in a gesture of trust and shared purpose. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation he'd been avoiding, but tonight belonged to preparation and the kind of quiet courage that sustained men through their darkest hours. In the distance, a coyote's howl carried across the wilderness, lonely and defiant, a sound that perfectly captured the spirit of creatures who refused to surrender to forces beyond their control. The night passed in restless vigil, with Elias keeping watch from a concealed position among the rocks above his destroyed home. The mare grazed quietly nearby, her presence both comfort and reminder of the responsibilities that weighed on his shoulders. Moses had refused to leave his side, the old dog's instincts telling him that danger still lurked in the darkness beyond their small circle of safety. As dawn broke across the valley, Elias made his way carefully back to the ruins of his shack. In daylight, the destruction seemed even more thorough and vindictive. But the searchers' failure to find what they were looking for gave him a crucial advantage. They didn't know about the second cache or the evidence that could expose the truth about the Blackwood family's criminal origins. His first priority was finding Matilda. After an hour of searching, he discovered the cat hiding in a crevice beneath the collapsed roof of his lean-to, frightened but unharmed. The reunion with both his animal companions reminded him of what he stood to lose if he pursued this fight to its conclusion, but also strengthened his resolve to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The immediate question was where to go. His property was clearly compromised, and returning to his normal routines would only make him an easier target. But he needed allies and information, both of which required venturing into town despite the obvious risks. His first stop was Doc Sullivan's office, where he arrived before the doctor's usual morning rounds. The physician took one look at his disheveled appearance and quickly ushered him inside, drawing the curtains before settling into his chair with grave concern. "They came for you, didn't they?" Doc said without preamble. Elias nodded wearily. "Destroyed everything I owned, looking for something they think I have." "And do you have it?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Elias studied the doctor's face, seeing genuine concern tempered with the caution of a man who understood the dangerous currents flowing through their community. "I have something," Elias admitted carefully. "Something that could change a lot of people's understanding about the past." Doc Sullivan leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are others who've been asking questions, Elias. People from outside the territory, claiming to represent interests back east. They've been inquiring about historical property transactions, about families who might have claims dating back to the 1870s. This information added another layer of complexity to an already precarious situation. What kind of people? Lawyers, mostly. But also a woman well-dressed, educated, asking very specific questions about the Colorado Springs bank robbery and what happened to the victims' families. Elias felt his pulse quicken. Could this woman be related to one of the families who'd lost money in the original theft? If so, she represented a potential ally, someone with legitimate claims on the treasure and perhaps the resources to challenge the Blackwood family's power. "Where is she staying?" he asked. "The hotel, under the name Catherine McKinnon. She's been very discreet, but word travels in a town this size." The name sent a shock through Elias's system. McKinnon, the same surname as his late wife Sarah. Could this be a coincidence, or was there a family connection he'd never known about? The timing seemed too precise to be random. Doc Sullivan continued, his expression growing more serious. "There's something else you need to know. Cornelius Blackwood has been meeting with Sheriff Porter privately, and there's talk about bringing in additional law enforcement from the territorial capital. They're claiming concern about criminal elements operating in the area." The implications were clear. Blackwood was maneuvering to have Elias arrested on fabricated charges, using his influence with local law enforcement to eliminate the threat legally and quietly. Once he was in custody, any evidence he'd gathered would disappear, and the truth would be buried permanently. "I need to examine that mare of yours," Doc said suddenly. "There's something about her that's been bothering me since you brought her home." They made their way carefully to where Elias had hidden the mare, taking a circuitous route to avoid observation. In the clear morning light, Doc Sullivan studied the animal with the clinical eye of someone trained to notice details others might miss. "Help me move her mane," he instructed, running his hands along the mare's neck. "There, do you see that? Under the long hair of her winter coat, almost invisible unless examined closely, was a brand mark that had been deliberately obscured. The symbol was distinctive, an intertwined JC surrounded by a circle, partially burned over with a different iron to make it harder to read. "That's not just any brand," Doc said grimly. "That's the mark of James Cassidy himself. I've seen it in wanted posters and territorial records. This mare didn't just belong to him, she was his personal mount, the horse described in every account of his capture." The confirmation of what Elias had suspected still hit him like a physical blow. He was caring for an animal that had lived through the events he'd been researching, a creature that had witnessed the robbery, the betrayal, and the aftermath that destroyed so many lives. "But that's impossible," Doc continued, his voice filled with wonder and unease. "If this is truly Cassidy's horse, she'd be approaching 30 years old. No animal lives that long under normal circumstances, especially not with the kind of hard use she'd have endured. The supernatural implications were becoming impossible to ignore. The mare's longevity, her uncanny knowledge of hidden treasure locations, her apparent understanding of complex situations, all suggested forces beyond normal comprehension. "What if she's been waiting?" Elias asked quietly. "What if she's been carrying this burden all these years, waiting for someone who could finish what her master started?" Doc Sullivan studied the mare's intelligent eyes, noting the same unsettling awareness that had struck Elias from their first meeting. "Animals don't typically harbor grudges or pursue justice," he said slowly, "but I've seen enough in my years to know that the world holds mysteries we don't fully understand." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Through the trees, they could see Sheriff Porter leading a group of 4 men toward Elias's destroyed property. The search was expanding, becoming more systematic and thorough. "They're closing in," Doc warned. "You need to get out of the area, at least until you can figure out your next move." But the mare had other ideas. As they watched the searchers below, she began moving restlessly, her attention fixed on something in the distance. Following her gaze, Elias spotted a lone rider approaching from the south, a woman on a well-bred horse, riding with the confidence of someone comfortable in the saddle. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about the rider's posture and bearing. As she drew closer, Elias caught sight of auburn hair beneath a practical riding hat and features that made his heart race with impossible recognition. "Sarah," he whispered, the name escaping before he could stop it. But as the woman came into clearer view, he realized his mistake. This wasn't his late wife returned from the grave, but someone who bore such a striking resemblance that the similarity was unmistakable. The same green eyes, the same determined set to her jaw, even the same way of sitting her horse that had made Sarah so distinctive. "That's Catherine McKinnon," Doc said softly, "the woman who's been asking questions about the robbery." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into place with stunning clarity. Catherine McKinnon, the same surname as Sarah, the same distinctive features, arriving just as the truth about the Cassidy treasure was emerging. This couldn't be coincidence. The mare's behavior confirmed his suspicions. She was watching the approaching rider with the same intense interest she'd shown when leading him to the treasure sites, as if this woman's arrival was part of some larger plan that had been decades in the making. "I need to talk to her," Elias said, his mind racing through the implications. "That's dangerous," Doc warned. "If Blackwood's men see you together, they'll know you're coordinating against them." But the mare was already moving, picking her way down the hillside toward the valley floor with obvious purpose. Her message was clear: the time for hiding was over. The final pieces of Jim Cassidy's plan were falling into place, and she intended to see it through to completion. Elias made his decision with the certainty that had guided him through every major choice of his life. "Some things are worth the risk," he told Doc Sullivan. "If this woman is who I think she is, she has as much right to the truth as anyone." The doctor nodded grimly. "Then God help you both, because once you reveal what you know, there'll be no going back." As they made their way toward the meeting that would determine the fate of all their careful plans, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that forces beyond his understanding were converging on this remote valley. The mare's impossible longevity, Catherine McKinnon's timely arrival, even the timing of his own discovery of the treasure, all suggested a design too intricate to be mere chance. Whether guided by justice, fate, or the lingering spirit of a man who died trying to right his wrongs, Elias Boone was about to discover that some debts could only be paid across generations, and some truths were powerful enough to reshape the foundation of an entire community. The mare nickered softly as they approached the valley floor, her eyes bright with anticipation. After 16 years of waiting, James Cassidy's final mission was about to begin in earnest. The meeting took place in a grove of cottonwoods beside the creek that ran through Elias's valley, far enough from his destroyed home to avoid immediate detection by Blackwood's searchers. Catherine McKinnon dismounted with fluid grace, her movements betraying both confidence and caution as she studied Elias with eyes that held startling familiarity. "You're Elias Boone," she said, her voice carrying the educated accent of someone raised far from frontier territories. "I've been hoping to meet you." "And I've been wondering who you really are," Elias replied, noting the way the mare had positioned herself between them, as if facilitating an introduction she'd long planned. "Doc Sullivan says you've been asking questions about the Colorado Springs robbery." Catherine's expression grew solemn. "My family lost everything in that theft. Not just money, but lives and futures that were destroyed by men who cared nothing for the innocent people they hurt." She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio, opening it to reveal documents and photographs that made Elias's breath catch. The central image was a formal portrait of a man in a bank uniform, standing beside a woman holding two small children. The resemblance between the woman in the photograph and Sarah McKinnon was unmistakable. "This is my grandfather, Thomas McKinnon," Catherine explained. "He was the head clerk at First National Bank of Colorado Springs. He was one of the men murdered during the robbery, shot down while trying to protect the customers who'd been trapped inside during the theft." The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. Sarah's family connection to the robbery explained so much: her occasional nightmares about violence she'd never witnessed, her inexplicable fear of banks and large crowds, the way she'd sometimes stared into the distance as if seeing ghosts from a past she couldn't remember. "Sarah was your cousin," he said quietly, the pieces of a decades-old puzzle finally falling into place. Catherine nodded, tears brightening her eyes. "My father's younger brother. She was only a child when the family scattered after the robbery, too young to remember the full tragedy. But some memories linger in the blood, even when the mind forgets." She withdrew another document from the portfolio, a letter written in faded ink on bank stationery. "This is grandfather's final letter to his wife, written the morning of the robbery. He'd discovered irregularities in the bank's accounts, transactions that suggested someone was providing information to criminals about gold shipments and security procedures." Elias read the letter with growing amazement. Thomas McKinnon had been investigating evidence of an inside conspiracy, tracing financial records that pointed to corruption within the bank itself. His final words to his wife revealed his intention to confront the bank's president about his discoveries, a confrontation that had been interrupted by bullets from Jeremiah Blackwood's gun. "He knew," Catherine said softly. "Grandfather knew someone inside the bank was involved, but he died before he could expose the truth." The mayor had been listening to their conversation with obvious interest, and now she moved to a fallen log that lay partially buried in the creek bank. She began pawing at a section of rotted wood, her actions suggesting yet another discovery waiting to be made. Following her guidance, Elias and Catherine worked together to clear away debris and expose what appeared to be a waterproof oilskin packet wedged deep within the hollow log. Inside the packet were documents that made their previous discoveries pale in comparison. Original bank records in Thomas McKinnon's careful handwriting, detailing financial irregularities and suspicious transactions dating back months before the robbery. But it was the final item in the packet that changed everything. A letter from James Cassidy himself, addressed to Thomas McKinnon and dated the day before the robbery. The letter revealed the truth that had been buried for 16 years. James Cassidy hadn't been the mastermind of the Colorado Springs robbery, he'd been trying to prevent it. Thomas McKinnon had contacted him through intermediaries, asking for help in exposing the conspiracy he'd discovered within the bank. Cassidy, seeking redemption for previous crimes, had agreed to gather evidence of the inside job. The plan had been for Cassidy to infiltrate the robbery crew and gather proof of Jeremiah Blackwood's involvement, then work with McKinnon to expose the corruption before the theft could take place. But Blackwood had discovered their correspondence and accelerated his timeline, turning what should have been an evidence-gathering operation into a massacre designed to eliminate both men who threatened his plans. "My God," Catherine whispered as she read the letter. Cassidy wasn't the villain, he was trying to be a hero. The letter continued with details that painted a completely different picture of the infamous robbery. Cassidy had tried desperately to stop the violence once it began, but Blackwood's hired killers had been under orders to leave no witnesses. The deaths of the bank employees hadn't been the result of a robbery gone wrong. They'd been calculated murders designed to silence men who'd discovered too much. Cassidy's final paragraphs revealed his plan to recover the stolen gold and return it to the victims' families, along with evidence that would expose Blackwood's role in the conspiracy. But his capture had prevented the completion of his mission, leaving the truth buried along with the treasure he'd hidden. "That's why she led me to the gold," Elias said, looking at the mare with new understanding. "She's been waiting all these years for someone who could finish what her master started." Catherine studied the ancient horse with wonder and growing respect. "She's been carrying this burden for 16 years, waiting for the right people to come together at the right time." The sound of distant voices interrupted their revelations. Through the trees, they could see Sheriff Porter's search party moving methodically through the area, getting closer to their hiding place with each passing minute. "We need to move," Elias said urgently. "But first, there's something else you need to see." He led Catherine to the carefully concealed location where he'd hidden the original strongbox, revealing the fortune in gold coins that represented the stolen money her grandfather had died trying to protect. Her reaction was everything he'd hoped for, not greed or excitement, but a deep sense of justice finally being served. "This belongs to the families who lost everything," she said firmly. "Grandfather always said the money was meant for widows and orphans who had no other support. That's where it needs to go." The mare's soft nicker seemed to express approval of Catherine's words. For the first time since Elias had known her, the ancient horse seemed truly at peace, as if a burden she'd carried for decades was finally being lifted from her shoulders. "There's more," Elias said, showing Catherine the map that indicated the third location, the site on Blackwood's property where the final cache might be hidden. "If we're going to expose the truth completely, we need to recover all the evidence Cassidy gathered." Catherine's expression grew determined. "Then that's what we'll do. My grandfather died for this truth, and your Sarah lived her whole life haunted by shadows she couldn't understand. We owe it to them both to see this through." The approaching voices were getting closer, making further discussion impossible. As they prepared to flee deeper into the wilderness, Elias couldn't help but marvel at the intricate design that had brought them together. 3 generations after the original crime, the descendants of victim and would-be redeemer were finally united in their quest for justice. The mare led them away from the search party with the same uncanny knowledge she'd displayed throughout their partnership. But her movement seemed different now, less urgent, more purposeful, as if she knew the end of her long mission was finally approaching. As they rode toward whatever confrontation awaited them at Blackwood's property, Elias understood that they were no longer just seeking treasure or even justice. They were completing a story that had begun with betrayal and murder, carried forward by the impossible loyalty of a horse who'd refused to let her master's final mission die with him. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows, where it had hidden for 16 years, and no amount of wealth or influence would be able to bury it again. The third site, marked on Cassidy's map, lay deep within Cornelius Blackwood's sprawling ranch property, a location that would require careful planning and considerable courage to reach undetected. As they studied the terrain from a concealed vantage point on the neighboring ridge, the challenge seemed almost insurmountable. Blackwood's ranch headquarters sprawled across a natural bowl in the hills, with the main house commanding views in all directions. Outbuildings included a massive barn, several corrals, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse for the considerable workforce required to maintain such an operation. Most concerning were the armed men who patrolled the property with military precision, clearly more than simple ranch hands. "He's turned his place into a fortress," Catherine observed, studying the layout through a pair of field glasses she'd produced from her saddlebag. "Those men aren't cowboys, they're gunfighters." The mare stood quietly between them, her attention fixed on a specific area near the ranch's original homestead site. According to the map, That was where Cassidy had hidden his final cache, the evidence that would complete their case against the Blackwood family. "There," Elias said, following the mayor's gaze to a grove of ancient oaks that predated the ranch buildings. "That's where we need to go." The grove was perhaps half a mile from the main house, positioned near what appeared to be the remnants of an old foundation, possibly the original homestead that had existed before Blackwood's grandfather acquired the property. The location offered some concealment, but reaching it would require crossing open ground that was clearly visible from multiple observation points. "We'll need a distraction," Catherine said thoughtfully, "something significant enough to draw their attention away from that area." As if summoned by their planning, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them retreat deeper into the rocks. Through the gaps in their concealment, they watched Sheriff Porter arrive at the ranch with a full posse, riding directly to the main house where Cornelius Blackwood emerged to greet them. Even at a distance, the men's body language suggested urgent consultation. Porter gestured toward the surrounding hills, while Blackwood pointed in various directions, clearly organizing an expanded search operation. The net was tightening around them with each passing hour. "They know we're in the area," Elias said grimly. "It won't be long before they find our trail." Catherine studied the scene below with the calculating expression of someone accustomed to strategic thinking. "That might work in our favor. If they're organizing a manhunt, most of their men will be deployed away from the ranch itself." Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected sound, the approach of additional riders from the east. Martha Hendricks appeared first, followed by Doc Sullivan and a group of townspeople Elias recognized as local merchants and ranchers. The delegation rode with the determined purpose of citizens who'd reached the end of their patience. "What are they doing here?" Catherine asked. Through the field glasses, they could observe the confrontation developing in the ranch yard. Martha Hendricks dismounted and approached Blackwood with obvious anger, gesturing emphatically as she spoke. Doc Sullivan flanked her, his medical bag prominently displayed as if to emphasize his professional authority. The mayor's behavior grew increasingly agitated as she watched the scene below. She paced restlessly, occasionally nickering in what sounded almost like communication with the distant horses. Her distress suggested she understood the danger facing the townspeople who'd come to confront Blackwood. "They're trying to help us," Elias realized with growing alarm. "Martha and Doc must have figured out what's happening. They're trying to buy us time." The confrontation below was escalating. Blackwood's men had moved to positions that subtly surrounded the townspeople, while Sheriff Porter appeared to be trying to mediate between the two groups. The body language suggested accusations and denials, with Martha Hendricks clearly not accepting whatever explanations were being offered. "We have to move now," Catherine said urgently, "before this turns into something worse." But the mayor had already made that decision for them. She began picking her way down the hillside toward the ranch, following a route that would keep them concealed until they reached the grove of oaks. Her path suggested years of observation and planning, as if she'd been studying this approach for longer than seemed possible. Following the mayor's lead, they descended through a maze of gullies and rock formations that provided surprising concealment. The route was longer than a direct approach, but it kept them hidden from the main areas of activity around the ranch headquarters. As they drew closer to their objective, details became clearer through the field glasses. The grove of oaks surrounded what was indeed an old foundation, but there were also signs of more recent disturbance areas where the earth had been excavated and carefully refilled. "Someone's been digging here," Catherine observed. "Recently, by the look of it." The implications were chilling. Had Blackwood already discovered and recovered Cassidy's final cache? If so, their mission might be too late, and the evidence they needed to expose the truth might already be destroyed. But the mayor's certainty suggested otherwise. She approached a section of the grove that showed no signs of recent disturbance, an area near the largest oak where the ground remained undisturbed by whatever excavation had taken place elsewhere. The tree itself was massive, easily a century old, with a trunk that would require 3 men to encircle. At its base, partially concealed by decades of fallen leaves and accumulated debris, was a hollow that had been carefully sealed with stones and mortar. Working quickly but quietly, they cleared away the concealment to reveal what appeared to be a natural cache, modified by human hands to create a secure hiding place. Inside the hollow was another oilskin packet, this one larger and more carefully wrapped than the others they'd discovered. The contents took their breath away. Along with more gold coins was a thick sheaf of documents that represented the culmination of Thomas McKinnon's investigation and James Cassidy's evidence gathering. Bank records, correspondence between Jeremiah Blackwood and known criminals, financial documents showing the transfer of stolen money into legitimate investments, everything needed to prove the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. But the most damning evidence was a signed confession from Jeremiah Blackwood himself, written in his own hand and witnessed by two men whose signatures were notarized. The document detailed his role in planning the robbery, his decision to eliminate witnesses, and his subsequent theft of the recovered gold that should have been returned to the victims' families. "He wrote this before he died," Catherine said wonderingly. "Guilt finally overcame greed, and he documented everything." The confession explained how Jeremiah had used his position within the banking community to identify opportunities for theft, how he'd recruited criminals to carry out the actual robberies, and how he'd systematically betrayed his partners to avoid suspicion while keeping the proceeds for himself. Most shocking of all was his admission regarding James Cassidy. The confession confirmed what they'd learned from other sources. Cassidy had been working with Thomas McKinnon to expose the conspiracy, and his supposed leadership of the robbery had been a fabrication designed to deflect suspicion from the real mastermind. "Cassidy died for someone else's crimes," Elias said quietly, "and the real criminal built an empire on the proceeds." The mare stood guard while they examined the evidence, her ears constantly swiveling to monitor the sounds from the ranch headquarters. The confrontation between the townspeople and Blackwood appeared to be intensifying, with more of his men moving into positions around the gathered citizens. "We need to get this evidence to safety," Catherine said, carefully repacking the documents. "But first, we have to help those people down there." The sound of raised voices carried across the distance, punctuated by what might have been threats or ultimatums. Martha Hendricks was still standing her ground, but the situation was clearly deteriorating rapidly. As they prepared to leave the grove, Elias made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath the foundation stones was a final cache, not gold or documents, but weapons and ammunition that Cassidy had apparently stockpiled for the confrontation he'd known was coming. The rifles were well maintained despite their age, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from the elements. Along with them were boxes of ammunition and what appeared to be a detailed plan for exposing Blackwood's crimes, a plan that had been interrupted by Cassidy's capture but could still be executed by those who understood his true mission. He was planning a siege, Catherine realized, not to steal money, but to force the truth into the open. The mayor's behavior grew increasingly urgent as the sounds from the ranch suggested the confrontation was reaching a dangerous climax. Her message was clear: the time for hiding and planning was over. The final phase of James Cassidy's mission was about to begin, and it would require every ounce of courage they could summon. As they prepared to reveal 16 years of buried truth, Elias couldn't help but marvel at the forces that had brought them to this moment. The mayor's impossible loyalty, Catherine's quest for family justice, his own discovery of purpose after years of solitude, all had converged to create an opportunity for redemption that might never come again. The confrontation that would determine the fate of an entire community was about to begin, and the outcome would depend on the courage of people who'd been underestimated by those who wielded power through fear and corruption. In the distance, the sound of Martha Hendricks's voice carried clearly across the valley, strong and uncompromising, as she demanded answers that had been hidden for too long. The reckoning that James Cassidy had died trying to achieve was finally at hand. The church bell in Cedar Ridge had not rung outside of Sunday services in anyone's memory, but Martha Hendricks knew desperate times called for desperate measures. As she pulled the rope with steady determination, the bronze bell's voice carried across the valley with urgent authority, summoning the community to witness what would either be justice served or tragedy unfolding. From their position near the oak grove, Elias and Catherine could see the effect of Martha's signal. People emerged from buildings throughout the ranch complex, while in the distance, riders could be seen converging on the town from all directions. The bell was more than a call to assembly. It was a declaration that the time for secrets had ended. "She's making this public," Catherine said with admiration. "Whatever happens now, it won't be hidden or forgotten." The mare responded to the bell with obvious agitation, pacing in tight circles as if the sound triggered memories of other times when that same bell had called the community to face crisis. Her distress suggested she understood the significance of what was unfolding, the culmination of events she'd been waiting decades to see resolved. Down at the ranch headquarters, Cornelius Blackwood's reaction to the bell was immediate and telling. He barked orders to his men, sending some toward town while positioning others in defensive positions around the main buildings. His body language spoke of a man who'd been expecting this confrontation but had hoped to control its timing and location. Sheriff Porter found himself caught between competing loyalties as more townspeople arrived in response to Martha's summons. Doc Sullivan had positioned himself prominently in the gathering crowd, his medical bag and authoritative presence lending credibility to whatever accusations were about to be made. "They're giving us our chance," Elias realized. "While everyone's attention is focused on the confrontation, we can get the evidence to safety." But the mare had different ideas. Instead of moving away from the ranch, she began walking directly toward the main house, her gait steady despite her limp. Her intention was unmistakable. She meant to be present for the revelation she'd spent 16 years waiting to see. "She wants to be there," Catherine said with sudden understanding. "This is her vindication as much as anyone's." They followed the mayor's lead, using the growing chaos of the assembly to conceal their approach. The weapons they'd discovered in Cassidy's cache remained hidden, but the documents were carefully secured in Catherine's saddlebag, ready to be produced when the moment was right. As they drew closer to the crowd, individual voices became audible over the general commotion. Martha Hendricks stood on an overturned crate, addressing the assembled townspeople with the kind of moral authority that came from decades of honest dealing and community service. "We came here seeking answers about activities that threaten the safety and security of our families," she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "We've heard rumors of violence, of threats made against decent people, of searches conducted without legal authority." Cornelius Blackwood attempted to interrupt, but the crowd's mood was clearly against him. These were people who'd known Martha for years, who respected her judgment and trusted her character. When she spoke of threats and violence, they listened. "These accusations are ridiculous," Blackwood protested, though his defensive tone suggested otherwise. "I'm a respectable businessman who's contributed significantly to this community's prosperity." "Built on what foundation?" Doc Sullivan interjected, stepping forward with documents of his own. "Built on whose suffering and sacrifice?" The doctor's question hung in the air like an accusation, and Elias realized that he and Catherine weren't the only ones who'd been researching the Blackwood family's origins. Doc Sullivan had been conducting his own investigation, perhaps suspecting the truth for longer than anyone had realized. It was then that Catherine made her move. She rode forward into the crowd, the mare following with obvious purpose. The ancient horse's appearance created a stir of recognition among some of the older residents, men who remembered stories their fathers had told about famous outlaws and the animals they'd ridden. "My name is Catherine McKinnon," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of education and righteous anger. "My grandfather was Thomas McKinnon, head clerk at the First National Bank of Colorado Springs. He was murdered during the robbery of 1874, shot down while trying to protect innocent customers." The mention of the notorious robbery silenced the crowd. Everyone in the territory knew the story, or thought they did. But Catherine's next words began reshaping their understanding of events they'd believed were settled history. For 16 years, the wrong man has been blamed for that crime, she continued, producing Jeremiah Blackwood's confession from her saddlebag. The real mastermind, the man who planned the robbery and ordered the murders, built his fortune right here in Cedar Ridge. Cornelius Blackwood's face went white as Catherine began reading from his father's confession. The document detailed Jeremiah's conspiracy with criminal associates, his decision to eliminate witnesses, and his subsequent theft of the recovered gold that should have been returned to the victims' families. "That's impossible," Blackwood stammered. "My father was a respectable banker who came here with legitimate resources." "Resources stolen from widows and orphans," Catherine replied, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade. "Money that was meant to provide for families destroyed by your father's greed." The mare had positioned herself prominently in the crowd, and her presence was beginning to trigger recognition among those old enough to remember the stories. One grizzled rancher stepped forward, studying the ancient horse with growing amazement. "That's Cassidy's mare," he said wonderingly. "I'd swear by all that's holy, that's the horse that belonged to Gentleman Jim himself." The identification sent a ripple of excitement and unease through the crowd. If this was indeed Cassidy's horse, then her presence at this revelation seemed to carry supernatural significance. Elias chose that moment to step forward, producing the additional evidence they'd gathered from Cassidy's caches. "James Cassidy wasn't the villain history made him out to be," he announced. "He was trying to expose the conspiracy, working with Thomas McKinnon to prevent the robbery before it could happen." He showed the crowd Cassidy's letter to McKinnon, explaining how the plan to gather evidence had been discovered and turned into a massacre. The documents painted a picture of betrayal and murder that cast the entire story in a completely different light. Sheriff Porter found himself in an impossible position as the evidence mounted against the man who'd been one of his primary financial supporters. His loyalty to the badge required him to investigate the accusations, but his practical understanding of local politics suggested the dangers of challenging such a powerful family. "These documents could be forgeries," he said uncertainly, "without proper authentication." "Then authenticate them," Doc Sullivan interrupted, producing a magnifying glass from his medical bag. "Examine the paper, the ink, the handwriting. Test them against known samples." But it was the mayor who provided the most compelling authentication. As the crowd debated the evidence, she walked directly to Cornelius Blackwood and fixed him with a stare that seemed to carry the weight of years and the memory of crimes that demanded justice. The banker's reaction was everything his accusers could have hoped for. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger and fear. He stepped backward involuntarily, as if the horse's presence carried some threat he understood, but couldn't articulate. "Get that animal away from me," he demanded, his voice cracking with strain. "Why?" Martha Hendricks asked pointedly. "What are you afraid of?" The question hung in the air as the crowd waited for an answer that never came. Instead, Blackwood turned to his men, clearly preparing to end the confrontation through force if necessary. "Clear this rabble off my property," he ordered. "Use whatever means necessary." But his gunfighters hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of using violence against women, elderly citizens, and a crowd that included the town's doctor and most respected merchant. The moral weight of the evidence being presented was affecting even hired guns who'd thought themselves immune to such considerations. It was in that moment of uncertainty that the mare made her final, decisive contribution to the confrontation. She walked to the exact spot where Jeremiah Blackwood's confession indicated the original homestead had stood, the place where the family's criminal empire had begun, with blood money and murdered dreams. There, with the entire crowd watching, she began pawing at the ground with her good front foot, scraping away earth and debris to reveal what appeared to be additional evidence buried beneath the very foundation of the Blackwood Ranch. What the mare's pouring revealed silenced even Cornelius Blackwood's protests. Buried beneath the ranch's foundation stones was a leather satchel that had been carefully wrapped and hidden for decades. Inside were the original bank deposit slips from the Colorado Springs robbery documents that proved exactly which families had lost money and how much they were owed. Catherine knelt beside the excavation, her hands trembling as she examined papers that contained her grandfather's careful notations. Each slip represented a family destroyed, a future stolen, a life altered by the greed of men who'd valued gold more than human dignity. "Here," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she held up a deposit slip. "Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell Widow's Pension Fund, 847. Mr. James Morrison Orphanage Construction Fund, 200. Mrs. Sarah McKinnon Family Savings Account, 340. The last name sent a shock through the crowd. Sarah McKinnon, Elias's late wife, whose family connection to the robbery was now revealed with heartbreaking clarity. She'd lived her entire life, haunted by shadows she couldn't understand. The granddaughter of a man murdered for trying to protect money meant for families like her own. Doc Sullivan took the deposit slips, examining them with the methodical attention that had made him a trusted physician. "These are genuine," he announced. "The paper, the ink, the bank's official seal, everything authenticates. This is proof of who the real victims were." The mare had completed her final task. With obvious exhaustion, she moved to stand beside Elias, her muzzle touching his shoulder in a gesture that seemed both farewell and blessing. Her life's purpose was finally fulfilled. The truth had been revealed, the evidence preserved, and justice was within reach. Sheriff Porter found himself facing a moment that would define his integrity for the rest of his life. The evidence before him was overwhelming, but acting on it would mean challenging the most powerful family in the territory. His hand moved instinctively toward his badge, weighing duty against survival. "Cornelius Blackwood," he said finally, his voice carrying newfound authority, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the victims of the Colorado Springs bank robbery." Blackwood's reaction was immediate and desperate. "You can't arrest me based on ancient documents and the ravings of people seeking financial gain," he protested. "My family has contributed more to this territory than all of these people combined." "Contributed stolen money," Martha Hendricks replied firmly. "Built prosperity on the graves of innocent people." It was then that Blackwood made his fatal mistake. Seeing his world crumbling around him, he reached for the gun at his hip, clearly intending to fight his way out of the confrontation. But his movement was clumsy with panic, and Doc Sullivan was closer than he'd realized. The doctor's medical bag swung with surprising force, connected with Blackwood's wrist just as he cleared leather. The gun flew across the yard, landing harmlessly in the dirt, while Blackwood clutched his injured hand. "Violence was your grandfather's answer too," Doc said grimly. "It didn't serve him well in the end." Blackwood's men found themselves surrounded by an aroused community that had finally seen the truth about their supposed benefactor. These weren't hired gunfighters facing helpless victims. They were outnumbered professionals confronting citizens who'd been pushed beyond endurance. One by one, they began surrendering their weapons to Sheriff Porter, recognizing that resistance would only compound the charges they were already facing. The moral weight of the evidence had shifted the balance of power completely. As the crowd processed the magnitude of what they'd witnessed, Catherine approached the mayor with documents that would change everything. She'd been examining the deposit slips more carefully, and what she'd discovered brought tears to her eyes. "There's more," she announced to the gathering. "The bank records show that some families were owed more than just their original deposits. With interest compounded over 16 years, the total amount stolen from the victims' families exceeds the value of everything the Blackwood family owns." The implications were staggering. Not only could justice be served, but the victims' descendants could be fully compensated for decades of poverty and hardship that should never have been endured. But it was the mare's condition that commanded Elias's immediate attention. The ancient horse was swaying on her feet, her breathing labored, and her eyes growing dim. The completion of her 16-year mission had taken the last of her supernatural strength. "Easy, girl," he whispered, supporting her weight as she began to sink toward the ground. "You did it. You finished what he started." The mare's eyes found his face one final time, and in them he saw not pain or fear, but satisfaction and peace. She'd carried her burden across impossible years, waiting for the right people to come together at the right moment. Now, with James Cassidy's name finally cleared and the truth exposed, she could rest. Doc Sullivan knelt beside them, his medical training automatically assessing the situation, even though he knew there was nothing he could do. "She's not suffering," he said gently. "She's just tired, more tired than any living thing should ever have to be." The crowd fell silent as they witnessed the passing of a creature who'd become legend in their own time. The mare's final breath was peaceful, her body settling gently onto the earth, as if she was simply lying down to sleep after a very long day. In the hush that followed, even Cornelius Blackwood's protests seemed insignificant. They'd witnessed something beyond normal experience, the completion of a mission that had transcended death itself, carried forward by loyalty that had lasted longer than human memory. Sheriff Porter cleared his throat, bringing focus back to practical matters. "There'll need to be a proper investigation," he announced. "Federal authorities will have to be notified about crimes that cross territorial boundaries." "And restitution," Catherine added firmly. "Every family named on these deposit slips, every descendant of the original victims needs to receive what's rightfully theirs." The process would take months, perhaps years, but the foundation for justice had finally been laid. The Blackwood Empire would be dismantled, its assets distributed to those who'd been wronged by its foundation of blood and theft. As the crowd began to disperse, carrying news that would transform the territory's understanding of its own history, Elias remained beside the mare's still form. She'd given him purpose when he'd thought his life was over, shown him that redemption was possible even when it seemed impossibly distant. Martha Hendricks approached, her eyes bright with tears and triumph. "She was waiting for you," she said softly. "All these years, she was waiting for someone who'd understand what needed to be done." Doc Sullivan joined them, his medical bag now serving as a pillow for the mare's head. "Some bonds transcend the ordinary world," he observed. "Some missions are too important to be stopped by death." As the sun began to set over the valley, where truth had finally emerged from decades of shadow, Elias understood that his own mission was just beginning. The gold would be returned to its rightful owners, but someone would need to tell the story, to ensure that the real heroes and villains of the Colorado Springs robbery were remembered correctly. James Cassidy and Thomas McKinnon had died, trying to prevent injustice. The mayor had spent 16 years ensuring their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. Now it fell to the living to honor their memory by building something better on the foundation of truth they'd finally been able to establish. In the gathering dusk, as the community of Cedar Ridge began to understand how completely their world had changed, the spirit of justice that had driven an impossible partnership between man and horse finally found its rest. 6 months after the mayor's passing, the memorial stone stood proud and weathered on the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, carved from granite, quarried in the same mountains where James Cassidy had died 16 years before. The inscription was simple but profound. "In memory of Gentleman Jim Cassidy and his faithful mare, true servants of justice who never abandoned their mission to right the wrongs of the past." Elias Boone stood before the memorial in the early morning light, his hands holding a bouquet of wildflowers that Moses had helped him gather from the meadow where the mare used to graze. The old dog sat patiently beside him, understanding in the way that faithful animals do, that this was a moment for remembrance and reflection. The transformation of Cedar Ridge had been remarkable to witness. Where Cornelius Blackwood's shadow had once cast fear and uncertainty over the community, there was now a sense of renewal and honest prosperity. The bank had been reorganized under federal oversight, its assets distributed to the descendants of families who'd suffered from the original robbery. Catherine McKinnon had stayed to oversee the restitution process, her legal training and family connection to the victims, making her the natural advocate for justice delayed, but finally served. She'd purchased a small house on the outskirts of town, claiming she'd found peace in the place where her family's long quest for answers had finally been resolved. The financial impact had been profound. Families who'd struggled for generations suddenly found themselves able to purchase land, start businesses, and provide education for their children. The money that should have supported widows and orphans 16 years ago was finally fulfilling its intended purpose, compounded by years of careful investment by those who'd unknowingly profited from its theft. Elias himself had kept only enough from his share of the treasure to rebuild his modest home and secure his future. The rest had gone to the restitution fund, along with a donation to establish a scholarship for children whose families had been affected by historical injustices. It seemed fitting that money born from tragedy should create opportunities for young people to build better futures. The mare's legacy lived on in more ways than just the memorial. Doc Sullivan had documented her story in meticulous detail, creating a record that would preserve the truth about her impossible mission for future generations. The account had been submitted to territorial authorities and historical societies, ensuring that the real story of the Colorado Springs robbery would replace the fabricated version that had protected the Blackwood family's reputation. Martha Hendricks had emerged as the town's unofficial leader, her role in exposing the truth, having earned her respect that extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. She'd been instrumental in establishing new businesses and attracting honest investment to replace the economic influence that had been lost with the Blackwood Empire's collapse. Sheriff Porter had redeemed himself through his commitment to justice during the investigation's aftermath. His willingness to arrest Cornelius Blackwood, despite personal and professional risks, had demonstrated the kind of integrity that made him worthy of the badge he wore. The territorial government had recognized his service with a commendation and expanded authority to investigate historical crimes. But it was the personal transformations that moved Elias most deeply. Catherine had shared stories about families who'd received restitution, children who could now attend school, widows who could afford medical care, young men who could purchase land and start their own ranches. The ripple effects of justice served continued spreading throughout the territory, touching lives in ways that would resonate for generations. The mare's burial site had become a place of pilgrimage for those who'd heard the story. People came from neighboring territories to pay their respects to an animal who'd somehow transcended the normal boundaries between species and purpose. Some left flowers, others carved their own small memorials, all recognizing that they'd witnessed something beyond ordinary experience. Elias had acquired a young horse to help with his work, a gentle bay gelding who showed intelligence and sensitivity, but nothing approaching the mare's supernatural awareness. He was grateful for the reminder that his partnership with Cassidy's horse had been unique, never to be repeated, but always to be treasured. His daily routines had settled into comfortable patterns that honored both solitude and community. He still spoke to the wind during his morning walks, but now he also visited town regularly, sharing meals with Martha and discussing the territory's future with Doc Sullivan. The isolation that had once been born from loss had transformed into chosen simplicity, the difference between loneliness and peaceful independence. Catherine often joined him for these visits to the memorial, their friendship deepened by shared purpose and mutual respect. She'd mentioned plans to write a book about the events they'd lived through, believing that the story deserved to reach audiences far beyond Wyoming territory. People need to understand that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied, she'd said during one of their conversations. Sometimes it just takes longer to find the right people to carry the torch. On this particular morning, as Elias arranged the wildflowers near the memorial's base, He reflected on how completely his life had changed since that day when he'd spent his last dollar on a limping horse nobody wanted. The creature who'd seemed broken and worthless had carried within her the power to transform an entire community's understanding of its own history. Moses suddenly alerted, his ears pricking toward the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Catherine appeared over the ridge, riding her mare with the easy confidence that had characterized all her movements since their first meeting. She dismounted and joined Elias beside the memorial, her own bouquet of flowers adding color to the simple monument. "I received word from the territorial capital," she said, her voice carrying satisfaction and relief. "Cornelius Blackwood's appeals have been exhausted. He'll serve his full sentence for fraud and conspiracy." The news brought closure to a chapter that had begun with robbery and murder 16 years before. Justice had finally been served, not just for the original victims, but for all those who'd suffered under the Blackwood family's criminal legacy. "And the federal investigation?" Elias asked. "They've recommended that the case be used as a model for addressing historical crimes throughout the Western Territories. What we accomplished here could help other communities uncover their own buried truths." As they stood together in the morning sunshine, overlooking the valley where so much history had been made and remade, Elias felt the deep contentment that came from understanding one's purpose in the larger scheme of things. He'd been chosen by fate, by the mare, by circumstances he still didn't fully understand to help complete a mission that had seemed impossible. The wind carried familiar scents across the memorial site, wildflowers and sage, the distant smoke from cooking fires, the clean smell of rain approaching from the western mountains. But now the wind seemed to whisper satisfaction rather than restlessness, peace rather than urgent need. As they prepared to leave, Catherine placed her hand on the memorial stone, her expression thoughtful and grateful. "Do you think she knows?" she asked. "Do you think she can see what came from her sacrifice?" Elias considered the question as he watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. "I think some bonds are stronger than death," he said finally. "Some missions are too important to end just because the body gives out." They rode back toward town together, their horses' hoofbeats marking a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a community reborn. Behind them, the memorial stood sentinel over the valley, a permanent reminder that truth had the power to transform even the most carefully constructed lies. That evening, as Elias sat on his rebuilt porch with Moses at his feet and Matilda purring in his lap, he opened his father's worn Bible to a passage that had taken on new meaning since his adventure began. The words spoke of justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, of the patient faith required to see God's plans fulfilled across generations. In the distance, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled like stars brought to earth, each one representing a family touched by the mare's impossible mission. The community that had once lived in the shadow of stolen prosperity now basked in the honest light of truth revealed and justice served. Sometimes, Elias reflected, as he prepared for sleep, the loneliest among us were chosen for purposes greater than we could imagine. Sometimes what looked broken carried within it the power to heal wounds that had festered for decades. And sometimes, if we listened carefully to the wind and trusted the wisdom of creatures who couldn't lie, we could become part of stories that would outlive us all. The mare had found her rest, but her legacy would endure in every act of justice served, every truth revealed, every wrong made right by those who had the courage to complete missions that others had begun. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest treasure of all, the knowledge that some things mattered enough to fight for, regardless of the personal cost. Under stars that had witnessed both the original crime and its ultimate resolution, Elias Boone slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that his part in an impossible story had been faithfully completed.